On November 22, 1963, John F. Kennedy ate 2 soft-boiled eggs in a Fort Worth hotel. 5 hours later, he was dead. 4 American presidents were assassinated. More than a dozen others came within inches, and almost every one of them sat down to an ordinary meal first, having no idea it would be their last. Number 10 on this list involves a feeding method so disturbing doctors banned it. Number 6, the assassin got drunk instead. And number 1 was never eaten at all. Hit subscribe. Let us count down. Number 20, the midnight ride and the meal Lincoln skipped. 4 years before Ford's Theater, Abraham Lincoln was already a marked man. In February 1861, Detective Alan Pinkerton uncovered a plot to murder the president-elect as he changed trains in Baltimore on his way to his own inauguration. The solution was theatrical. Lincoln swapped his famous stovepipe hat for a soft felt cap, draped an overcoat across his shoulders, and boarded an overnight train posing as the invalid brother of Pinkerton's female agent, Kate Warren. Here is the detail history almost forgot. There is no record of Lincoln eating a single thing that entire night. The berths were short. The 6'4" president lay folded up behind a curtain, and the train rolled through Baltimore at 3:30 in the morning while the city slept. No dinner, no coffee, nothing. The man who would spend the next 4 years famously forgetting to eat, surviving on an apple and a glass of milk while running a civil war, began his presidency exactly the same way. Hungry, hidden, and hunted. The newspapers mocked him for sneaking into Washington. 4 years later, nobody was laughing. Number 19, Andrew Jackson's rice and milk. On January 30th, 1835, Andrew Jackson became the first American president anyone ever tried to assassinate. He was leaving a congressman's funeral at the Capitol when a house painter named Richard Lawrence stepped out of the crowd, leveled a pistol at the president's chest, and pulled the trigger. The percussion cap snapped. The gun misfired. Lawrence pulled a second pistol. That one misfired too. The odds of both weapons failing have been estimated at 1 in 125,000. Jackson, 67 years old and dying by inches from old bullet wounds and chronic disease, did not run. He charged the man with his cane and had to be pulled off him. Now, here is the part about food. By that winter, the hero of New Orleans could barely eat. His ruined digestion had reduced him to an invalid's diet, and accounts from his final years describe him living largely on rice, bread, and milk. The most feared man in America, the general who dueled and brawled his way into the White House, faced down 2 pistols on a stomach full of what was essentially nursery food. He survived the guns. The rice and milk carried him another 10 years. Number 18, William Howard Taft's Border Banquet. October 16, 1909. President Taft crossed into the space between El Paso, Texas, and Juarez, Mexico, to meet Mexican dictator Porfirio Diaz. It was the first meeting ever between an American and Mexican president, and the danger was so extreme that thousands of troops lined the route. That evening, the 2 leaders sat down to a lavish, multi-course state banquet, exactly the kind of meal Taft was built for. This was a president who reportedly started his day with steak and stood as the greatest eater ever to hold the office. But earlier that day, a legendary scout named Frederick Russell Burnham and a Texas Ranger had wrestled a man to the ground along the procession route. The man was standing feet from the path of both presidents. In his hand, concealed, was a loaded pistol, 2 heads of state, 1 squeeze of a trigger away from a double assassination, and hours later Taft was working his way through a banquet as if nothing had happened, because as far as he knew, nothing had. The full story of how close it came stayed quiet for years. Taft ate well that night. He never knew how easily it could have been his last course. First pattern break. Here is the strange thread running through this entire list. Presidents almost never saw it coming, and the food proves it. Condemned prisoners get to choose their last meal. They order steak, they order pie, they say goodbye. Assassinated presidents got no such courtesy. Their last meals were Tuesday meals, hotel eggs, cold chicken on a train, toast. There is something almost unbearable about that ordinariness. These were the most protected, most powerful men on the planet, and death still walked up to them between breakfast and lunch. Keep that in mind as we get closer to the top of this list, because the meals get smaller, sadder, and more human the closer these men got to the end. Number 17. Theodore Roosevelt's dinner at the Gilpatrick, October 14th, 1912, Milwaukee, Wisconsin. Teddy Roosevelt, campaigning to take back the White House, ate dinner that evening at the Hotel Gilpatrick before heading out to give a speech. Roosevelt was a famously enormous eater, a man who reportedly took his coffee in a cup closer to a bathtub and could demolish a plate of fried chicken with white gravy like it owed him money. Dinner finished, he walked out of the hotel, climbed into an open car, and stood to wave at the crowd. A saloon keeper named John Schrank shot him point blank in the chest. The bullet punched through his steel eyeglasses case and a folded 50-page speech in his breast pocket before lodging in his ribs. Roosevelt coughed into his hand, saw no blood, concluded the bullet had missed his lung, and then did the most Roosevelt thing in American history. He went to the auditorium and gave the speech anyway. 84 minutes, blood spreading across his shirt, opening with the line that it takes more than that to kill a bull moose. The dinner at the Gilpatrick stayed down through all of it. The bullet stayed in his chest for the rest of his life. Number 16. Franklin Roosevelt's fishing trip feast. In February 1933, President-elect Franklin Roosevelt spent 12 days aboard the Norma Hall, the luxury yacht of his friend Vincent Astor, fishing his way through the Bahamas before taking office in the depths of the Depression. Days of salt air, fresh-caught fish, and the kind of shipboard meals only an Astor's galley could produce. On the evening of February 15th, tanned and rested, he came ashore in Miami to give a short speech from the back of an open car in Bayfront Park. An unemployed bricklayer named Giuseppe Zangara climbed onto a wobbling chair 30 feet away and emptied a pistol at him. Zangara missed Roosevelt entirely. He hit 5 other people, including Chicago Mayor Anton Cermak, who was standing beside the car shaking Roosevelt's hand. Roosevelt ordered Cermak loaded into his car and held him upright all the way to the hospital, telling him to keep still. Cermak died 19 days later. Zangara went to the electric chair barely a month after that. Roosevelt went on to be inaugurated and serve 12 years. The last carefree meals of his entire life may well have been those fish dinners on Astor's yacht. He came off that boat into the Depression, an assassination attempt, and a world war, and he never really got to leave the table of history again. Number 15. Harry Truman's lunch before the gunfight. November 1st, 1950, was a brutally warm afternoon in Washington. Harry Truman was living at Blair House across from the White House, which was being gutted and rebuilt. Truman was a man of iron routine, plain Missouri habits, and famously modest lunches. And after his midday meal that day, he went upstairs, stripped to his underwear, and lay down for his usual nap. At about 2:20, 2 Puerto Rican nationalists, Oscar Collazo and Griselio Torresola, walked up to Blair House from opposite directions and tried to shoot their way through the front door. What followed was the biggest gunfight in Secret Service history, 27 shots in under 40 seconds. Truman, hearing the shooting, came to the upstairs window in his underwear and looked directly down at the fight until a guard screamed at him to get back. Torresola died on the sidewalk. So did White House policeman Leslie Koffelt, who, mortally wounded, still rose up and killed the assassin with a shot to the head. Truman ate dinner that evening and kept his full schedule. He said afterward that a president has to expect these things. But he never forgot Koffelt the man who traded his own life for the president's afternoon nap. Number 14. Richard Nixon's cottage cheese, February 22, 1974. At Baltimore, Washington Airport, a failed tire salesman named Samuel Bick shot his way aboard a Delta flight, killed the pilot and co-pilot, and tried to force the plane into the air. His plan, laid out in tapes he mailed to celebrities, was to crash the jetliner into the White House and kill Richard Nixon. Police shot him through the aircraft door before the plane ever left the gate. Nixon, buried in Watergate, was going about his day, and if the pattern held, that day included the saddest presidential lunch ever recorded. Nixon ate the same thing nearly every day of his presidency: cottage cheese. Sometimes with pineapple or fruit, and by multiple accounts, sometimes doused in ketchup, a combination his own staff could barely watch. On his final day in office 6 months later, his last lunch in the White House was documented for history: cottage cheese and pineapple. So while a man with a gun was trying to turn a passenger jet into a missile aimed at his house, the most powerful man on earth was likely sitting behind the resolute desk, eating diet curds off a tray. Bick's plot was so far ahead of its time that almost nobody took the lesson. 27 years later, the world learned it the hard way. Number 13. Gerald Ford's 17 Days. No president on this list was hunted quite like Gerald Ford in September 1975. On September 5th in Sacramento, Ford was shaking hands in a park when Manson follower Lynette Squeaky Fromm raised a Colt 45 2 feet from his stomach and pulled the trigger. There was no round in the chamber. 17 days later in San Francisco, on September 22nd, a woman named Sarah Jane Moore fired a revolver at him from 40 feet. A bystander named Oliver Sipple grabbed her arm as she fired, and the bullet missed Ford's head by inches. 2 women, 2 guns, 2.5 weeks, and through it all, Ford stayed devoted to a lunch so plain it became legend. His standard midday meal, served nearly every day, was a scoop of cottage cheese, usually with a 1 steak sauce poured over it, sometimes with a sliced onion, followed by butter pecan ice cream. That is what fueled the most shot-at month any president ever survived. Ford refused to hide afterward. He said that if presidents could no longer walk among the people, something more important than one man's safety had already been lost. Second pattern. Break. Notice something? We are 14 entries in, and the food keeps getting humbler. Banquets gave way to cottage cheese. And that is not an accident. The modern presidency turned meals into fuel, eaten between motorcades, and the men eating them stopped paying attention to food at exactly the moment food became the last normal thing they would ever do. From here on, every single entry ends in blood. These next meals were eaten by 4 presidents and 1 almost president in their final hours or final days. This is where the list stops being trivia. Number 12. Ronald Reagan's lost lunch and first Jell-O. March 30th, 1981 was only Reagan's 70th day in office. That afternoon, he went to the Washington Hilton to address a union luncheon, the kind of rubber chicken banquet event presidents sleepwalk through. At 2:27, walking back to his limousine, John Hinckley Jr. fired 6 shots in under 2 seconds. A bullet flattened against the armored car door, ricocheted and sliced into Reagan's chest under his left arm, stopping 1 inch from his heart. Nobody even realized he had been hit until he started coughing up bright red blood in the car. In the emergency room, losing almost half his blood volume, Reagan looked up at the surgeons and said he hoped they were all Republicans. And here is the food detail that says everything about the man. Reagan, the president who kept a jar of jelly beans on the cabinet table and claimed you could tell a lot about a man by which color he picked, spent his first days of recovery on a hospital diet, working his way back up through liquids and soft food while cracking jokes on notepads because of the tube in his throat. He was the only sitting president ever wounded by an assassin and survive it. Every man remaining on this list was not so lucky. Number 11. James Garfield's last breakfast. On the morning of July 2, 1881, James Garfield was the happiest anyone had seen him in months. Just 4 months into his presidency, he was finally escaping Washington's brutal summer for a seaside vacation, then on to his college reunion. That morning at the White House, before leaving for the train station, the athletic 49-year-old was in such high spirits that, according to accounts from that day, he was doing handsprings and horsing around with his teenage sons. Breakfast in the Garfield White House was a hearty, farm-raised Ohio affair, and Garfield, a man who grew up in genuine log cabin poverty, never lost his appetite for simple abundance. He ate, said his goodbyes, and rode to the Baltimore and Potomac station with no bodyguard at all, because in 1881 presidents simply did not have them. Waiting in the ladies' waiting room of that station was Charles Guiteau, a delusional office seeker who believed God had commanded him to remove the president. Guiteau shot Garfield twice in the back at point-blank range. Garfield collapsed on the station floor, vomiting, bleeding, fully conscious. That ordinary family breakfast, eaten between handsprings, was the last real meal of his life. What came next is one of the most horrifying medical stories in American history. Number 10. The 79 days doctors starved a president. Here is the entry that should make you angry. The bullet in Garfield's back had missed his spine and every vital organ. Historians and doctors now widely agree he should have survived. Instead, a physician named Dr. Willard Bliss took control of the case and spent 11 weeks killing the president, slowly. Bliss and other doctors probed the wound repeatedly with unwashed fingers and unsterilized instruments, ignoring the new science of antisepsis, and pumped infection deep into Garfield's body. As raging infection destroyed the president's ability to keep food down, Bliss made it worse. He fed Garfield a rich invalid diet, and when the president's stomach rejected nearly everything, Bliss turned to feeding him rectally, administering so-called nutritional enemas of beef bouillon, egg yolk, and whiskey every few hours, a method that provided almost no actual nutrition. Garfield, a big, powerful man of over 200 pounds, wasted away to roughly 130. He lay through the hottest summer on record, cooled by a primitive air conditioner invented on the spot, dreaming out loud about food he could not eat. On September 19, 1881, after 79 days, he died of infection and starvation. Guiteau argued at trial that the doctors, not his bullet, had killed the president. Legally, he lost. Medically, he had a point. Number 9. William McKinley's breakfast at Niagara Falls. September 6, 1901 began as one of the best days of William McKinley's life. The president was the star attraction of the Pan American Exposition in Buffalo, a world's fair of electric light and American optimism. That morning, after breakfast, he and his beloved wife Ida took an excursion train to Niagara Falls, strolled the gorge, and enjoyed a leisurely luncheon at the International Hotel before returning to Buffalo. McKinley was a man of comfortable Victorian appetites, fond of hearty Ohio cooking, and that day he ate like a man on vacation, because he essentially was. His only official duty that afternoon was a public receiving line at the Temple of Music, where he insisted on shaking hands with ordinary citizens over his staff's objections. McKinley was famous for his handshake efficiency, clocked at dozens of grips per minute. At 7 minutes past 4, a young anarchist named Leon Czolgosz reached the front of the line with his right hand wrapped in a handkerchief. Hidden inside it was a revolver. He fired twice into the president's abdomen. McKinley's first thoughts were for others. He told his aides to be careful how they broke it to his fragile wife, and, seeing the crowd beating Czolgosz on the floor, gasped for them not to hurt him. Number 8. Toast, coffee, and a false dawn. For a week, America believed McKinley would live. The surgery had gone as well as 1901 surgery could. and the president rested at the Milburn House in Buffalo, cheerful and improving. Vice President Theodore Roosevelt was so confident he left to go mountain climbing in the Adirondacks. By September 11th, doctors decided the recovering president could try solid food again. McKinley was given his first real nourishment in 5 days, and accounts describe it as the gentlest meal imaginable. Toast dipped in coffee, a little chicken broth. After a week of nothing, the president reportedly received it like a feast, and his spirits soared. It was the last food William McKinley ever ate. What the doctors could not see was the gangrene spreading silently along the bullet track through his stomach and pancreas. Within a day of that modest breakfast, his pulse began to fail. By September 13th, riders were racing through the Adirondack darkness to find Roosevelt on a mountainside. In the early hours of September 14th, McKinley whispered the words of his favorite hymn, "Nearer, my God, to thee," told those around him it was God's way, and died. A piece of toast softened in coffee. That was the final meal of the 25th President of the United States. Third pattern, break. Now we arrive at April 14th, 1865, Good Friday, the single most dissected day in American history, and yet almost nobody talks about the meals. Over the next 5 entries, you are going to follow food through that one night in Washington and through one last November day in Texas almost a century later, a vice president saved by whiskey, a general saved by a dinner invitation, and 2 presidents, Lincoln and Kennedy, eating simple food with hours left to live. If this list has a heart, it starts now. Number 7. The dinner invitation that saved Ulysses S. Grant. The morning papers on April 14, 1865, announced that President Lincoln and General Grant would attend Ford's Theater together that night. John Wilkes Booth read those papers. His plan was a double killing. The president and the general, who had just won the war, in one box with 1 bullet each. But Julia Grant could not stand Mary Lincoln, and after one social humiliation too many, she pressed her husband to decline. Grant begged off, telling the president they wished to visit their children in New Jersey, and the Grants boarded an afternoon train instead. Late that night, the couple stopped in Philadelphia and sat down to a late supper at a hotel near the ferry. By most accounts, an oyster supper, the classic 19th century late-night meal. It was there, at the table, that the telegrams found them. The president had been shot. Grant went pale and silent. Julia would later remember something else. A strange man on horseback who had peered into their carriage that day, and a rider who had seemed to follow their train. Booth's conspiracy had marked Grant for death, and a plate of oysters in Philadelphia is where he learned how narrowly he had missed the appointment. Number 6. The assassin who chose the bar instead. Here is the entry from the intro, and it may be the only time in history that alcohol saved a president's life. Booth's plot on April 14th was not 1 murder but 3, timed for the same hour. Booth would kill Lincoln, Lewis Powell would kill Secretary of State Seward, and a German-born carriage painter named George Atzerodt was assigned to kill Vice President Andrew Johnson. Atzerodt did everything right at first. He rented room 126 at the Kirkwood House Hotel, directly above Johnson's room. He had a gun and a knife. Johnson was unguarded, alone, and 1 flight of stairs away. And then, as 10 o'clock approached, Atzerodt went down to the Kirkwood House bar and started drinking. Then he kept drinking. He wandered out into the Washington night, drank at other saloons, threw his knife into a gutter, and never went anywhere near Johnson's door. While Lincoln lay dying and Seward lay slashed and bleeding, the vice president slept undisturbed, saved entirely by his assassin's nerve dissolving in whiskey. Hours later, Johnson stood at Lincoln's deathbed. By 10:15 the next morning, he was President of the United States. Atzerodt was hanged that July, having lost his courage, but not his sentence. Number 5. The bullet through Lincoln's hat. 8 months before Ford's Theater, Abraham Lincoln had already been shot at, and almost nobody knows it. On a hot August night in 1864, Lincoln was riding alone toward the soldier's home, his summer cottage 3 miles from the White House, when a rifle shot cracked from the darkness. His horse bolted, and when the president arrived at the gate, hatless, the soldiers who retrieved his famous stovepipe hat found a bullet hole punched clean through it, inches above his skull. Lincoln laughed it off and asked the soldiers to keep it quiet, insisting it was some careless hunter. It fits the man's fatalism, and it fits his eating too, because no president ever cared less about food. Contemporaries describe Lincoln forgetting meals entirely during the war, surviving whole days on coffee, an apple, and maybe a biscuit, eating mechanically while reading dispatches, a tall, gaunt man burning himself down to the wick. His secretaries had to remind him lunch existed. The story goes that he would eat an apple in a peculiar way, turning it slowly while he worked. A rifle bullet through his hat could not make this man take death seriously, and dinner could barely make him sit down. He had 8 months left. Number 4. Lincoln's Last Breakfast. The morning of April 14th, 1865, may have been the happiest of Abraham Lincoln's presidency. Lee had surrendered 5 days earlier. The war was, in every way that mattered, won. And at the White House breakfast table that morning sat his eldest son, Robert, a young officer just returned from Appomattox, where he had personally witnessed the surrender. Lincoln's breakfast, by long habit, was almost nothing. Typically a single egg and a cup of coffee, the sparse fuel of a man who treated eating as an interruption. But that morning the food was beside the point. Father and son lingered at the table while Robert described the scene at Appomattox, and Lincoln studied a portrait of Robert E. Lee that his son had brought, remarking on the general's fine face. He told Robert the war was over, that they must never see another, and talked hopefully of the future. Witnesses that whole day describe a Lincoln transformed, laughing, light, telling Mary in their afternoon carriage ride that they must both try to be more cheerful, that between the war and the loss of their boy Willie, they had both been very miserable. 1 egg, 1 coffee, 1 son, home safe from the war. 12 hours of life left. Number 3. Lincoln's Last Dinner. Lincoln's final meal has been argued about for a century and a half, which tells you how little anyone was paying attention at the time. The dinner was late and rushed. Mary and the president sat down at the White House around 6, with the carriage to Ford's Theater waiting, and the most repeated account of the menu, passed down through White House lore, says the table held mock turtle soup, roast Virginia fowl with chestnut stuffing, baked yams, and cauliflower with cheese sauce. Some historians doubt the details, and given Lincoln's habits, he likely ate sparingly whatever was served. What is certain is the mood. Lincoln was in no hurry to go. He reportedly would have preferred a quiet evening, but the papers had promised the public he would attend, and Lincoln would not disappoint a city celebrating victory. So he finished his dinner, met briefly with visitors, and climbed into the carriage. At Ford's Theater, during the third act of a comedy, at about 10:15, Booth stepped into the unguarded box and fired 1 shot into the back of the president's head. Lincoln never regained consciousness. He died at 7:22 the next morning in a boarding house across the street, and mock turtle soup entered American history. Number 2. Kennedy's Last Breakfast in Fort Worth. November 22, 1963, began in room 850 of the Hotel Texas in Fort Worth, in the rain. John F. Kennedy woke before 8, stepped outside without a coat to greet a soaked parking lot crowd of thousands, joking that Jackie was still getting ready because it takes her longer, but she looks better than we do when she does it. Then he went inside to a Chamber of Commerce breakfast in the hotel ballroom. 2,000 Texans, and the accounts of that morning describe the president's own meal as almost heartbreakingly ordinary. soft-boiled eggs, bacon, toast with marmalade, orange juice, and coffee. Around him, the room roared when Jackie entered in the pink suit that would end the day stained with his blood. Kennedy was relaxed, funny, at the top of his game. Upstairs afterward, he and Jackie marveled at the artwork Fort Worth citizens had hung in their suite. Actual Monets and Van Goghs borrowed from local collections, and he phoned one of the organizers to say thank you. Then he glanced at the morning paper, saw a hostile full-page ad, and told Jackie, "We're heading into nut country today." The flight to Dallas took 13 minutes. Hotel eggs and coffee, the last meal of the last morning of Camelot. Number 1. The steak lunch that was never eaten. The most haunting presidential meal in American history sat under warming covers in a Dallas exhibition hall, waiting for a man who was already dead. At the Dallas Trade Mart on November 22, 1963, roughly 2,600 guests were seated for a luncheon in the president's honor. The menu was pure Texas hospitality, steak with all the trimmings, plated for the most powerful man in the world, due to arrive shortly after 12:30. At 12:30, 6 minutes away, the motorcade turned onto Elm Street through Dealey Plaza. 3 shots. At the Trade Mart, the head table stayed empty. Guests heard sirens scream past outside. Rumors moved through the room like weather. And then a stunned official confirmed the unthinkable to a hall full of people sitting in front of the president's untouched lunch. Some wept openly. A priest led prayer. 2,600 steaks went cold in a silent room. Every other meal on this list was eaten. This one just waited, the place set, the chair empty. The clearest picture ever made of how an ordinary American afternoon breaks in half. Kennedy was pronounced dead at 1 o'clock at Parkland Hospital, less than 5 miles from his own table. So here is what stays with me. Not the guns, the EGGS, the toast dipped in coffee, the cottage cheese. Death came for these men between the most ordinary bites of the most ordinary days, and not one of them saw it coming. Drop a comment. Which meal will you never forget? Lincoln's mock turtle soup or the 2,600 cold steaks in Dallas? I read every comment. And if this gave you chills, subscribe, because next week we are opening the White House kitchen files nobody talks about.